and I can't tell you how I am to introduce our keynote speaker. Sort of the convention that we're using for the conference is we want people to read the bios online, but I'm making an exception here because I want to highlight just a couple of things from your unbelievably busy career in public service and private and big firm service. Secretary Johnson is a partner in Paul Weiss. He was the Secretary of Homeland Security from 2013 to 2017. He was General Counsel of the Department of Defense from 2009 to 2012. General Counsel of the Air Force from 1998 to 2001. And he was an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York from 1989 to 91. And sir, you may appreciate my colleague, Professor Shane Stansbury, came from the Southern District. And I like to call that the special forces of the U.S. Attorney's offices because they seem to get some of the biggest and toughest cases.
We call ourselves the Sovereign District of New York. We accepted, we did not acknowledge oversight from DOJ Maine.
Yes, that word has spread.
Yeah.
Sir, there's lots of things I want to cover, but I do want to jump in with, I guess, what's on top of everybody's mind. What is your assessment of the Ukraine situation?
First of all, Major General Dunlap, thank you for inviting me to Duke. I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. I am certain that the weather there in North Carolina is much better than it is up here in the Northeast today. Snow, sleet, ice, rain, cold. I'm looking forward to the first signs of spring. I also want to take a little detour because seeing you, Charlie, reminds me of our days when I was the General Counsel of the Air Force and you were the Deputy Judge Advocate General of the Air Force. We had a great time together from 1998 to 2001, over 20 years ago now. This is supposed to be a keynote address, so I always like to, warm up the crowd with a story or two. And I have two, bear with me, two Air Force stories. One, you got to appreciate for me, when I was appointed to be General Counsel of the Air Force in October 1998, I was totally new to national security. I had never set foot in the Pentagon. I did not serve in the military. And overnight, I became a four-star equivalent. Everybody, as you know, far better than I, associated with the Department of Defense has to have a rank or an equivalent rank. So you know where they fit in. And it dictates everything in terms of who gets on the phone first, how you refer to people, how you end your emails, so forth, and just the pecking order, who gets to tell who to do what. And so it was a huge learning experience for me to all of a sudden be in the midst of the E-ring and military culture at the very top of military. And I was settling into my nice big office in the E-ring. And it was a nice office. It looked out on the monuments and everything on the fourth floor of the Pentagon, just a couple doors down from the Secretary of the Air Force. And I was having framed and hung by this gentleman who was a civilian who'd worked in the Pentagon for a million years, my presidential appointment and my Senate confirmation. And he said to me with his, tool belt and everything, "Where's your third one?" And I said, "What do you mean my third one?" "Your third certificate." And I said, "I'm not sure what you're referring to." And he said, "Well, aren't you the General Counsel of the Air Force?" "Yeah." And he said, "Well, don't you know that as the General Counsel of the Air Force, you're governor of an island?" And I said, "You're kidding. I'm governor of an island?" And I went to one of my deputies and I asked about this. And he said, "Yes, sir. Sure enough, by virtue of delegations in law and DOD regs and Air Force regs, the General Counsel of the Air Force for years has been the civil administrator of Wake Island, Pacific." Don't know how that happened, but there it was. So I was very excited that I was governor of an island. I never got to visit my island.
I was going to ask you.
No, I never got to visit Wake Island. It's just, not much going on there. Some migratory birds and a refueling stop maybe. And I came home that evening. I told my wife she was first lady of an island. She was not that impressed. And I told my dad, who was impressed. My dad got really excited. He went to a flag shop in Canal Street in Lower Manhattan and found the Wake Island flag for me.
Really?
And I don't know how he did that. And then one day I got in the mail at the Pentagon a very thick letter with a lot of canceled stamps on it from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. From, I don't know whether you ever heard this story, Charlie, from the person who claimed to be the natural born ruler of Wake Island. And he was sending me a bill for rent for his island. And we didn't respond. So the next letter I got from him simply said, I hereby declare war against you for refusing to pay for my island or give up my island. And I did ask my staff, can we just surrender? And they said, no, you can't. The other very transformational experience for me was, protocol matters for everything. And, as a civilian new to this, your first instinct is to sort of play down your new stature. And I was told you can't do that because you're denigrating the stature of your office. You can't do that. It's an institutional thing. So I tried hard, and it dictates where you fit in the pecking order, dictates even where you sit in the car.
It does.
And so we were at a Corona conference, and I was with General Ryan, the chief of staff of the Air Force at the time. And he said to me, Jay, come on, I'll give you a ride. And he had a staff car. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm a 4-star equivalent. But he's like 4 and change. So he's like 4 1/4. So I'm going to get in his staff car in the back on the left-hand side. And I did that. And just as I did that, General Ryan got in the driver's seat. So it's a little embarrassing. Thank God his exec got in the passenger's seat in the front, which saved me. Anyway, I have fond memories of my 27 months as General Counsel of the Air Force. It was my introduction to national security and the many things that occurred after that. Ukraine, it's a big question. First, I agree with the emerging sort of talking head point of view out there that Vladimir Putin is very dangerous and he is losing his grip on reality. Yeah. He's been president of Russia far too long. He's isolated. I think he's lost perspective on what he's gotten his nation into. I have to believe that there are members of his cabinet who are scratching their heads at this one and very worried about the cliff that he is driving them off. I do not understand what his military objective can be in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Even if his military is able to push aside the existing Ukrainian government, that's not going to change the hearts and minds of 44 million people in that country who've lived as an independent, free nation now for 30 years since the Soviet bloc fell apart. So I don't think this is not going to be pretty. I think it's going to get uglier before it gets better. I also believe that it is for Vladimir Putin destined to fail. This could be a long, drawn-out, protracted conflict, but I believe it is destined to fail. And it might even cost him, at the end of the day, his presidency. I think he's overplayed his hand. Though there's going to be a lot of sacrifice between now and then. I was asked this morning on television about what does this mean for the homeland? And I think the principal perspective on that is cybersecurity. We are imposing sanctions that principally involve the financial sector. And we know that the Russians have the capability to launch cyber attacks on critical infrastructure in Ukraine and in the United States, from the SolarWinds attack 2 years ago that landed malware in government agencies, in the private sector, and they have the capacity to do that. We have the capacity to respond too. But our cybersecurity at the moment is what concerns me most insofar as the homeland is concerned. My old agency, DHS, says that there is no specific or credible threat in cyberspace to the homeland, but we have to be vigilant. Those in the financial services sector in particular need to be prepared, need to raise their threat level, so to speak, because we could see some form of cyber attack in the current conflict.
Along that line, how concerned should the average American be about SolarWinds, meaning the idea that there may be malware embedded out there that we don't know about, that is, they're just waiting to activate, and it could come with little or no notice?
I think the possibility of that is moderate to high. Malware can be implanted that can lie latent for months. I'm not a cyber technical expert, but months,
right,
perhaps years. And for those of you who don't know this, the most devastating attacks in cyberspace occur simply because of an act of spear phishing. You know, if you're in the Duke University email system and you respond to an email from someone you think you know, and then you open the attachment, you might be letting the bad actor into the gate where he can then pose as virtually anybody and do almost anything to plant malware, espionage, ransomware, theft. And so very often something that has the capacity to shut down a pipeline in the Northeast can start simply because somebody opened an email that they shouldn't have.
If we could explore this a little bit more about the organizational aspect to this, you probably have seen that NSA has gotten involved with ransomware investigations and so forth, and the question's been raised, and of course DHS has its authorities. Question's been raised, is this a good thing to get the military involved in what very often, and maybe even typically, is a law enforcement matter? And the two sides, look at like the Posse Comitatus Act, and then the other side looks like, well, NSA is really the only game in town with these very high-end capabilities. What do you think about that organizational structure, that relationship? Or do you think we need to build another relationship? Or
Charlie,
another
I think
capability?
I think your question to a very large extent answers itself. I do not believe that NSA, US Cyber Command, the Department of Defense should be in the business of domestic cybersecurity, except to safeguard government networks themselves. In my judgment, the principal responsibility of the Department of Defense is offensive cyber capabilities directed against overseas bad actors, whether they be nation states or cyber criminals working, say, from a Russian platform. Domestically, the way I see it, the way we tried to explain it in the Obama administration, was pretty straightforward, which is you've got the FBI, who are the cops, and you've got DHS, now CISA, who are the firemen. The cops chase the bad guys, and DHS does the forensics and patches the vulnerabilities and helps the cyber security actor, most of whom are in the private sector, by the way, identify vulnerabilities and patch them. I was very pleased that Congress created the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is part of DHS, something I long supported. And we need a cybersecurity agency responsible for our domestic cybersecurity. And I think under the leadership of Chris Krebs in the last administration, CISA has been off to a pretty good start and has established a pretty good level of credibility. I think we need to get away from a lot of what you see in movies, frankly, that, you know, you've got NSA patrolling the domestic cyberspace, like that movie that came out about 20 years ago. I can't remember the name, Will Smith and Gene Hackman. NSA's principal responsibility should be outward looking on the global stage. And there's a lure and a perception that somehow because it's NSA, they do it better, or because it's the intelligence community, they do it better. I think there is work to be done on the domestic side, but there's a lot of really good capability on the domestic side. And, you know, whether it's the FBI, the Secret Service, and a number of other law enforcement cybersecurity organizations.
Since we're
if I could go back to something,
sure,
Charlie, because you kind of touched on it, but you didn't really. There, I believe, and I gave congressional testimony to this effect, that certain cyber attacks on the United States, on private infrastructure in the United States, can constitute an act of war. And I looked into this question in preparation for congressional testimony a couple of years ago. And basically the conventional wisdom, citing a guy named Charlie Dunlap, by the way, the conventional wisdom is that if the attack causes physical destruction in the same way a kinetic attack would, loss of property, loss of life on a large scale, it can be regarded as an act of war, warranting a response proportionate but not necessarily in kind. And I think we need to think along those terms. I've regarded now cyberspace as the principal battle space in the 21st century. And I think, notwithstanding the events of Ukraine, we are getting away from conventional nation state on nation state kinetic warfare. And the real battlefield is now in cyber.
Along that line, so many questions come to mind. One of the challenges, I wrote a blog post about this, is conducting war in the infosphere, which is not just cyber, but it's also the narrative and trying to confront, fake news and alterations of and deep fakes and so forth. You know, where do you think that should center in government? You know, we hear a lot about, the State Department is responsible for the public narrative, but, and overseas narrative, but it seems to be that those borders don't really mean as much. And how do you think that narrative, how we ought to build and reinforce that narrative? Should it be a government agency? Should it just be everybody? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's kind of very confused and all messed up right now. So I would begin answering the question by categorizing, let's take cyber threats. You've got basic criminal behavior, which is domestic. You've got traditional cyber espionage, which nations have done in one form or another now for literally centuries. That's nation on nation. Then you've got ransomware, theft, which can be conducted by an overseas actor or a domestic actor. And then you've got cyber attacks committed by a nation state on another, implanting malware, or what the Russians did to us in 2016 around our election. And I continue to believe that when you're dealing with domestic behavior, we have to reinforce the notion that domestic law enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, is the principal responsive actor on the government side. And when it comes to overseas actors, that's the point at which the FBI has a lot of capability, but there's also a role for NSA and U.S. Cyber Command and the intelligence community in general. It's confusing because there are, I guess, cyber attacks that can be domestic in origin, but have an international flavor to them. So, but I continue to believe that for reasons of posse comitatus, for reasons of our culture in this country, the Department of Defense, including all of it within it, NSA, Cyber Command, DIA, should not be in the day-to-day business of our cybersecurity in this country. Just like they're not in the day-to-day business of carjackings or basic aviation security or the like.
Now that you've been out a little bit, reflect upon I ask you to reflect upon your time at DHS, and what would, if you were secretary today, what would be on your to-do list?
Well, I wouldn't want to be secretary of DHS today, or at any point in the future. Wild, hungry crocodiles could not drag me back to that.
I can imagine a couple of years ago, I'm going to say, Secretary Johnson, you said you weren't going to, and here you are, Secretary of whatever.
Hank the Tank Bear couldn't drag me back to DHS. I did the job for 3 years. Interestingly, my time at DOD as the General Counsel of the Defense Department, given the time at which I served there, was the most intellectually challenging, stimulating time I spent in public service. DHS, you're on the defensive team and you're blocking and tackling. And one failure equals 1,000 successes, and very few people acknowledge the successes. They'll all look at you if there's a failure, if there are long lines at the airport's TSA, or if there's a terrorist attack, God forbid, or if there's a surge on the southern border. Everybody's looking at you for what you did wrong and why you're not getting it right. Very few, and this is true of the leadership, is true of the rank and file, very few will pat us on the back for, preventing something bad from happening, because most Americans don't even know when we prevented something bad from happening. And so looking back on that time, it was great to be a cabinet officer. It was great to lead a very large government agency of 230,000 people. I was determined to raise morale within DHS, because morale at DHS among all the federal agencies is always at the bottom of the list. And though we stayed at the bottom of the list my last year in office, we did raise morale a whole 3 percentage points. So I was very proud of that. And I even, to do that, I was going to raise morale if it killed me. And to do that, I did all kinds of crazy things. If you heard of the show Undercover Boss, I literally one day put on the TSA uniform at BWI and worked the lines one day.
Oh my goodness.
And escorted this couple to their gate. They were flying down in North Carolina, and I didn't tell them who I was. They had no idea who I was. And I finally said to the husband, "My name is Jay Johnson. Do you know who I am?" And he said, "Yeah, you just told me your name is Jay Johnson." And then I said to the wife there in the wheelchair, "Ma'am, I hope you realize that I am the head of this entire federal agency." And she said, "Well, congratulations on your promotion, young man." So, but I went to extraordinary lengths to raise morale. I wanted the workforce to see me working alongside them. look, you asked me what I'd be doing today. We don't like to admit this, but because there's so many different missions in DHS, but the mission that overwhelms all the others is immigration, border security. And the numbers of apprehensions on our southern border over the last year are the highest they've been in 20 years. It's over 100,000 a month. We reached almost 2 million apprehensions last fiscal year. For perspective, my 3 years as secretary, the highest we had, which felt like the world was coming apart, was 468,000. Last year, it approached 2 million. My lowest number was FY15, where we had 315,000, which was the second lowest number of apprehensions on our southern border since 1972. And yeah, I'm kind of proud of that because we enforced our immigration laws, but I like to think we tried to do the right thing and we tried to be humane about how we went about the job. Didn't always get it right. Certainly there was a lot of criticism on both sides. But immigration, border security overwhelms the mission set because it's such a politically volatile issue. And it's uppermost on the minds of politicians in Washington. There's a whole lot else that goes on in DHS: aviation security, maritime security, the Coast Guard, TSA, the Secret Service, FEMA, FLETC, immigration, refugee resettlement, naturalizations. But border security, frankly, is the most prominent, whether you like it or not.
You reminded me of another question I wanted to ask.
And of course, counterterrorism, which was, our the reason that DHS was created after 9/11.
You do remind me. It does remind me of another question that I wanted to ask you. You've had a distinguished government, public service, but also in the private world. I'm getting concerned, and tell me if you think I got this wrong, that the environment's gotten so toxic, the political environment's gotten so toxic, that will we have Jay Johnsons in the future willing to serve in government and go through what it takes to serve at the confirmation level? Or am I just overly concerned about it?
I am worried that because the political environment has become so toxic, we are losing really good, patriotic Americans willing to serve their country. And I worry that a reflection of who we are not going to ever get is the people who are retiring from Congress. There are a lot of good people retiring from Congress who worked hard to broker compromise to get stuff done for the American people, who politically kind of occupy the middle of the road, Republican or Democratic, and they're all retiring because of redistricting, because of polarization, because they're worried about getting primaried from the right or the left. And to me, that's a reflection of who we're going to be able to not recruit in the future. In addition to that, it is an extraordinary sacrifice for somebody who's been a professional in private life their entire adult life to put all that aside, go through the scrutiny, the examination, the clearances, the vetting, to get to a senior level job. I went through 3 Senate confirmations. I never want to do it again. Most people don't live their lives day to day into their 40s and 50s as if one day they're going to be facing a security clearance or a Senate confirmation. We just don't live our lives that way. And so if you asked most of my law partners, for example, who have been in their 50s and 60s their entire life in the private sector, are you willing and able to be nominated by the president for this Senate confirmed position? I think the answer would have to be no. So there's a lot of sacrifice to get there, saying nothing about the financial sacrifice. As the Secretary of Homeland Security, responsible for the security of our entire homeland, I have made what a second-year associate at Paul Weiss makes. So it was been out of law school for a year and a half. Go figure. My first paycheck when I was in Washington, can't remember whether it was Air Force or DOD. I got it in the mail, and I said, "Oh, look, dear, I got a travel reimbursement." I said, "No, that's your paycheck." So it is a huge sacrifice, really is. And I look at the people who are leaving Congress, and I look at some of the people who are entering Congress now and how they're running and the platforms they're running on. And I really do worry about the future of our democracy. There are still some good people there, and there are a lot of people who will say things on a public platform, and then you find out they're very reasonable behind closed doors or in the green room where you're waiting to go on Face the Nation, and you meet this person and, wow, this is a really nice guy. I wish I could know him better. So, but I worry about, my basic answer to your question is yes, I do worry about that.
Let me ask you kind of a similar question I asked you about DHS, about DOD. If you were the DOD, let's say DOD General Counsel today, what would be on your to-do list? In both DOD and DHS, I actually kept a to-do list in my top desk drawer, but I never got to it. Or at least if I got to it, I'd look at it once a month and maybe check one or two things off. There's your agenda, and then there's what's thrown at you. What lands in your inbox here that you have to deal with because the secretary needs you to deal with it, or Congress needs you to deal with it, or it's an urgent matter. And so, after confirmation, I sat down, I made a to-do list in each one of my 3 Senate confirmed jobs. But at the end of the day, what I actually accomplished looked very different than what I had set out to do. Just like, Joe Biden did not campaign for president on what he was going to do to beat Vladimir Putin off in Ukraine. It was thrust on him. When I was in office, I used to define a good day as when more than half the things on my calendar that day were things that I requested, meetings I requested versus meetings that were thrust on me by somebody else, by something else, because there is very little opportunity to advance your own agenda. If I were the DOD General Counsel today, what would be my number one priority? I couldn't tell you because I'm not there inside the Pentagon. I do suspect that Caroline Krass is spending a lot of time focusing on how they're going to stand up this new bureaucracy of lawyers to deal with crimes around sexual assault. The legislation requires that there be this independent line of prosecutors who make these judgments about these cases. And you got to stand up a bureaucracy across all the services to do that. And, with all due respect to my profession and yours, Charlie, we're not always very good at organizing stuff, just look at the military commission system, for example, and how long that's taken to even bring one case to trial. Yeah, I share the same concern about the bureaucracy that the legislation requires, and I also wonder how it's going to be, taken to by commanders in the field. But since you brought up the commissions, that does kind of remind me about something that I can remember we grappled with in DOD when we were there. Guantanamo. I think to some degree, almost every president, well, maybe.
If I were General Counsel today or the Secretary of Defense today, it'd be like probably my least favorite subject. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, do you think, I've always thought that the president ought to have the authority to designate where a trial is going to take place. So I don't think that the law is correct or constitutional. But do you think that they welcome the detainees in the Manhattan Correctional Center in the Southern District at this point?
Well, the political forces certainly did not in 2009. Today, I think it's probably a little different when you look at the number of terrorist cases that had run through Lower Manhattan, where the defendant has long since been convicted and is now serving a sentence, and there hasn't been a security breach. A little bit of history. When I came in as General Counsel of DOD in 2009, during the transition period, consulting a number of people like Charlie Dunlap and Bruce McDonald, I became a believer in a reformed military commission system. I became a believer and supporter of trying terrorists from overseas, members of Al Qaeda, the Taliban, in a military commission system, because that's traditionally what we've done with war criminals in the midst of a war. But the system needed to be reformed. Over and over, the JAG leadership said that the law then enabling the use of CID, statements taken as a result of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, delegitimized the system, and we got to get rid of that. And coming from the JAG leadership, I thought that was very compelling and very persuasive and very credible.
Well, and also I think the audience needs to know how supportive you were personally of the JAG Corps. So,
yes, I worked hard to build that relationship and maintain that relationship. But I became probably the Obama administration's principal proponent of reformed military commissions. And we got changes in the law through Congress in the first year in 2009. I testified a number of times before Congress in support of that law, in support of those reforms. And then the president decided he wanted to use the system, and we divvied up the cases that were at Guantanamo, the defendants who were at Guantanamo, how they should be prosecuted. I was supportive of sending the 9/11 defendants to the Southern District of New York. As a New Yorker who was present in New York on 9/11, I thought that because the victims of that attack were principally civilian and it occurred on US soil, that the 9/11 defendants should be prosecuted in the Southern District of New York. And other defendants like Nashiri, the Cole bombing, should be prosecuted in the military commission system. I got to be honest, and I want to say, don't quote me, but you know, this is an open forum here. Had I known then that we'd still be struggling with this system, now 12, 13 years later, I probably would have had a different view about the whole idea, because it has been one single point of failure after another, numerous delays. And how you resolve that, Charlie, I got to tell you, if today we offered back to the Department of Justice the 9/11 defendants, here, why don't you take them and prosecute them in the Southern District of New York? They'd probably say, speedy trial problems. And so I think it was Carol Rosenberg, who's been writing about Guantanamo now for 20 years. She writes for the New York Times now. I think it was her idea. You got to offer all these people plea deals. That might be the solution now. In terms of the closure of Guantanamo, at its height, it had over 600 detainees. We're now down to about 40. So we've effectively almost closed this thing. And at some point, we ought to just take the remaining detainees and sprinkle them around high security facilities in the United States, because it's costing us millions of dollars per detainee to keep this place open. And there are other valuable uses of Guantanamo Bay, as you know, Charlie. Mm-hmm. So it is the southernmost base of the US military in this hemisphere, and we need it for lots of other good reasons.
Let me switch gears here a little bit. You've worked with a lot of military lawyers, civilian lawyers, private practice lawyers. How would you, are they all the same, or do you lead them differently, or do you find, How do you feel about that? What's your reaction to that? These different kinds of or sources of lawyers that you've had a lot of familiarity with.
Very good question. In my experience, government lawyers, and I'm speaking principally of the civilian side now, who work in the Department of Defense, a lot of them are extraordinarily experienced, doing the same thing for years and years and years. And we had in the Pentagon the foremost expert on maritime law, who knew maritime law better than anybody, could write the book on it and probably did. And in the Air Force General Counsel's office, I had a law of space expert. I didn't even know there was such a thing as law of space. And then we had our fiscal law expert. Then we had our Clean Water Act expert. We even had an expert on the law of missile launches. That's all he did, missile launches, the law of missile launches. So you find within civilian bureaucracy a lot lawyers who are highly specialized in their very narrow band of practice. But if you ask them, can you think about a legal problem that is sort of 5 degrees to the right or 5 degrees to the left, they tend to get a little flustered. And they'll give you the answer that was always very unsatisfactory to me, which is, well, that's how we've always done it. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's right.
Yeah.
And can we go research this? And so that to a lot of lawyers who are very specialized, that's kind of a foreign concept. In private practice, particularly in a law firm where I work in a law firm of over 1,000 lawyers. The younger lawyers grapple with problems, which very often are first-time problems. And you call upon them to research the law, to look for what our options are, look for the right answer, to advocate something in a brief. And it requires a fair degree of creative, imaginary thinking. When I was at GC for DoD, I built a model that sort of married the two concepts. I had lawyers like Paul Kofsky, who the Deputy General Counsel of the Defense Department for Personnel and Health Policy, who's been there for 197 years. And he knows the Vacancies Act better than anybody in the federal government, I think. And then, so if you want the experts, you consult the experts. But then I also had this small group of special counsel who I would hire maybe a year or two out of law school or a year or two off of clerkship, who were really, really smart people. I couldn't believe I was hiring people who had just come off Supreme Court clerkships. It's like, my God, somebody who just comes up Supreme Court clerkship wants to work for me. Like Chris Fonzone, who is today the legal advisor to the DNI. And so the combination of career experts in law who know their area better than anybody, plus these bright young kids brought in to think about the really novel legal questions was a good marriage, so to speak. It worked because particularly in the first term of the Obama administration, there were a lot of fairly novel legal concepts that we wanted to think about or rethink from the Bush years. And so it worked well that way, I think. But it's an overgeneralization, obviously, but that's been my observation of private sector lawyers versus government lawyers.
Speaking of the Obama administration, there was, during the Obama administration, there was a pretty robust drone program. And, since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the president's talked about over the horizon operations. There hasn't actually been much of that. Yet there's a lot of criticism. And most recently, there was a special forces raid that, was successful. And that we ought to be doing more of that than than the drone strikes. But to me, I think people are forgetting that sometimes you got to fight your way in and fight your way out. What's your sense, especially now that you're out, and of what people want? Do you think that we'll continue to see the drone strikes? There have been a few, but not many. Or do you think that we should, from a political, legal, military perspective, do more of these special forces raids?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, obviously, Charlie. Now, if it's
I tell my students, facts matter, and I think you just
facts matter. Yes, right. If you can access the location on the ground, and there are innocent civilians on site, and you can get in and get out, then and minimize collateral damage, then yes. And I was actually part of the legal thinking that went into the Bin Laden raid, for example, in 2011. There were 4 lawyers in the Department of Defense read into that operation, and I was one of the 4. So let's start with this, because you ask a big question. Drones. What we're really talking about is targeted lethal force. And targeted lethal force can occur from a manned fighter jet, from the deck of a Navy ship, or from an unmanned aerial vehicle, a drone. Air Force leadership used to tell me all the time, don't call it a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, because it's manned, except the man is on the other side of the world. But whether it's a drone, it could be a targeted missile from a manned aircraft, with a pilot in the aircraft, or it could be from the deck of a carrier, long-range missile strike, targeted very precisely with the technology we have today. I believe that is a good thing, because it does minimize collateral damage. Rather than take out a whole city block to kill someone, you can literally target a vehicle on this side of the street versus that side of the street, provided you got the target right and you're not making a mistake about what's going on in that particular SUV. Is it terrorist activity, or is it somebody on a humanitarian mission to deliver bottled water in downtown Kabul? Okay, so those mistakes are made. And what I wish the Department of Defense would do better, and I actually wrestled with this a bit when I was their lawyer, is when a strike happens and we make a mistake, let's not accept the easy explanation. Oh, well, they weren't the named objective, but they were associated with the terrorist organization, so collateral damage was 0, and you move on with little or no investigation. And then what happens when you do that is somebody from the New York Times starts investigating themselves, and they find all of these facts that suggest, no, your initial assessment was wrong. And then the Department of Defense says, oh, okay, we're going to now go investigate this. And they have to acknowledge that their initial assessment was wrong and the New York Times is right. Rather than go through that tortured exercise, which affects our credibility in that part of the world, let's ask the hard questions up front about the mistakes we do make and acknowledge the mistake. And if there are some accountability issues, with that up front, rather than just accept the expedient answer and hope nobody then asks questions later on. That's not unique to the U.S. military either. It occurs in domestic law enforcement, for example, on the streets of Minneapolis. Or imagine how many initial explanations of an encounter with a civilian that led to a death are readily accepted because there was no iPhone around with a camera. And so we got to do better there. But I believe that targeted lethal force is a more effective way of getting at your objectives and minimizing collateral damage. Now, the reason I think drones are controversial are people, it's kind of in our culture. People don't like it when you're able to kill somebody and not be in harm's way yourself. It seems too easy in a sense. And I think there's also a somewhat real concern that drone strikes could become an expedient substitute for law enforcement, for arresting them and bringing them to justice. And that the latter concern, I think, is a valid one, and we have to be careful in that regard. Do most Americans think about these issues? I don't think so. Most Americans, I tend to believe, want us to get the bad guys. We want you to get the bad guys. Go get the bad guys before they commit another terrorist act. But there are ways, I believe, in our process of target selection, find, fix, that we need to improve. What happened in Kabul was a tragedy that could have been avoided if we had had a different set of assumptions going in. It was made, the decision was made under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. All the lights, as you know, Charlie, were blinking red that there's going to be another terrorist attack. So it was really tragic.
I'd like to go to a couple of student questions we have, and this one is from Riley Flewelling, a 1L, who, by the way, is going to be doing an internship with the Air Force. In fact, all these students are going to be doing that. And here's her question. Based on your experiences handling the Ebola virus in 2014 and watching the COVID pandemic over the last few years, how do you think the U.S. can be better prepared for the next virus? Will it be a matter of security infrastructure, executive action, fighting disinformation, or something else? Do you think vaccine mandates will be more likely for future viruses with COVID as a precedent?
So Ebola was fundamentally different from COVID. Ebola was on a much smaller scale from a much different part of the world, and it was more confined. But the hysteria around Ebola felt like COVID in 2014. For a while when I was Secretary of DHS, anytime a passenger on a commercial aircraft bound for the US from whatever part of the world got sick in the restroom, that became a matter for the Secretary of Homeland Security, what to do with that person, whether they had Ebola or not, whether they'd been in Africa or not. The level of hysteria was high. COVID was, multiples of that. It touched every corner of this country and every corner of the globe. So globes don't have corners, but it touched every part of our world. In terms of the US response, it didn't have to be this way. We're approaching 1 million dead, and it didn't have to be that bad. Part of the reason is I think it is harder now in this country, for a lot of reasons, to summon us to one national objective. If we had all just put on the mask day one, the little 35-cent device that can save your life, if we'd all just started wearing masks, and if we had all gotten vaccinated as soon as it was feasible and available, and boosted as soon as it was feasible and available, the death toll would be much smaller. And our response, we're the mightiest healthcare provider of a nation in the world, but we had the poorest healthcare response because the response had become politicized. Doing certain things became seen as politically correct, or in other segments of society, politically incorrect. So all the available science suggests that wearing a mask, getting vaccinated saves lives. saves hospitalizations. And so the response did not have to be this bad. At DHS, the direct answer to your question, Charlie, is at DHS, I used to say to our people, you got to plan for the next crisis. Don't plan for the last crisis. So if we had responded as we did initially to COVID the way we did Ebola by just simply limiting travel, that was never going to be sufficient because it was way too contagious a virus. Just like, Omicron, which broke out in South Africa. So we figured, okay, we just limit travel from South Africa. That was never going to be sufficient. That variant was in this country like that. So the answer has to be a national response, not just putting the responsibility in the hands of TSA customs to limit travel. It has to be a national response. And my hope is that the next time around, we do better in that regard. COVID is going to be with us for the rest of my life and the rest of your life in some form and some variant. There are going to be spikes, hopefully not nearly as big as the spikes we've seen now that more and more people are being vaccinated.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. And it's from Madison Dunbar. She's a 1L, also going to an internship with the Air Force. See a pattern there, sir? And her question is, she worked in the Southern District, so you need to know this.
Okay.
Southern District of New York is known for being independent, nonpartisan, and is often called the Sovereign District of New York.
Right.
How did your time there as an assistant U.S. attorney from 1989 to 1991 shape your approach to both government and private sector lawyering?
Being an AUSA for 3 years was the best public service job I ever had. I was a young lawyer, 31 years old. I was hired in the fall of 1988 by Rudy Giuliani. He was the U.S. attorney then.
Yeah.
This is before you see the present Rudy Giuliani. Mm-hmm. And Rudy redefined the role of a U.S. attorney. He made the job single-handedly a more visible job and a more high-profile job. And when I got to the Southern District in January 1989, it was a collection of future legal superstars. Jim Comey, Louis Freeh, two future FBI directors were in that office. Fran Townsend, Ken Weinstein, future Homeland Security Advisor to President Bush. A number of people who went on to be U.S. Attorney themselves in the Southern District, the Eastern District, District of Connecticut, Pat Fitzgerald, U.S. Attorney in Chicago. I could go on and on. Dave Kelly, all these future crime fighters. It was a really good time to be in that office. The federal sentencing guidelines were new then, and a lot more cases were going to trial. In 3 years, I tried 12 jury cases. You don't try cases that much anymore. And at the end of the 3 years, I ran out of cases to try, so I went back to private practice. That was my jumping off point for public service. And I always had the itch to return to public service after that. So it was a really terrific experience.
Well, public service seems to have worked out for you, because I want to mention to our audience that you were the 2021 recipient of the American Lawyers Lifetime Achievement Award as an American statesman who's devoted his career to public interest. And I think that's really true. Just one quick last thing. What would you say, given all, including some of our discussion today, about a young person thinking about public service, not just the military, but civilian, or even outside of government, and another kind of public service in a private entity that is public service oriented?
I will repeat what I've said at a number of law school graduations, commencements, and so forth. Though if you are both a lawyer in private practice and a lawyer in public service. In public service, you may make a fraction of what you could make in private law practice. But the most rewarding things you do in your career will be things you did in public service. Helping to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell is something I'm immensely proud of, which I did in public service. Being part of the legal thinking that went into the bin Laden raid is the other thing I'm most proud of in public service, which I obviously could not do in private law practice. Though there are real sacrifices, I know a whole lot of lawyers who are career public servants whose job satisfaction level was always very high because they were making a difference, they were doing big things. And so I constantly encourage law students, young lawyers, even middle-aged lawyers, think about a career in public service. You will find that some of your most rewarding experiences are serving your nation, your country, your city, your community. And there's a lot of good work to be done there.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. We literally could not have had a better keynoter. I could sit here for another couple of hours, and I know our audiences would love it, just to, tap into your wisdom. And you've been so generous with your time. I really, really personally appreciate it. And I know our students and our audience around the globe really do. Thank you so much, sir. I hope our paths cross, because I do owe you dinner or something.